She had a number before she had a name. Designation K7 Orcs. Unit Class Domestic Cognitive Grade II. Registered to the Veth Dominion's Administrative Sector 3rd Ring Station Pale. Age at intake, unknown. Origin, unclassified. Value at last census, 42 Veth exchange weights, the price of a decent set of filtration membranes, or one healthy goat if you were trading in the outer settlements. She answered to Kale. She had decided that herself, sometime around her 12th year in the collar, when the number started to feel less like an identity and more like a wound that had never been allowed to close. The overseers let it pass. Names among the lower-grade domestics were tolerated the way you tolerate a dog giving itself a nickname. It costs nothing to allow it, and it keeps the animal calm. The collar itself was a slender band of bioluminescent Veth alloy tuned to her neural signature. It didn't shock. It didn't cut. It simply recorded every heartbeat, every deviation in cortisol, every microsecond of hesitation when she was given an order. The data fed back to the station registry every 6 hours. Obedience scores were updated daily. Kale had maintained a 97.4 compliance rating for 11 consecutive cycles, which was why she was assigned to the upper archive floors of the administrative sector, where the air was cooler, and the light came through actual glass windows rather than the flickering plasma strips of the lower rings. She was not supposed to read the documents she filed. She read every one. Not greedily, not obviously. She had learned long ago that the overseers watched for the specific micro-expression of curiosity, a slight forward tilt of the head, pupils widening. And she had spent years training her face into a smooth, unreadable patience that the senior overseer, a Veth called Oral Sec, had once described as pleasantly bovine. She filed, she cross-referenced. She carried sealed data cylinders from intake to the DPRAC shelving, and she read everything at the exact pace of a person who was not reading, which was the fastest she had ever learned to do anything. The Veth were not cruel exactly. That was the thing that was hardest to explain to the other domestics, most of whom had simpler assignments, kitchen labor, cargo shifts, atmospheric maintenance, and who had a more straightforward relationship with their discomfort. The Veth were efficient. They had conquered 43 inhabited systems in roughly 800 years, and in every single one they had arrived not with fire but with a census. They counted, they classified, they assigned grades. And then they built the infrastructure of control so quietly and so thoroughly that by the time most species understood what had happened, the architecture of it was already load-bearing. Remove it and the whole society collapsed, because the Veth had made themselves necessary. Water reclamation, atmospheric processors, seed banks, medical databases. The species they conquered didn't just submit, they became dependent. This was what Kale understood from the documents she was not supposed to read. This was why, on a morning in the 43rd year of the Veth Dominion's occupation of what had once been called Earth, she found herself standing very still in front of a sealed archive cylinder that someone had left improperly indexed, filed under Redundant Biological Survey, Pre-Conquest, Sector 7, and trying to decide whether to open it. The cylinder was old, pre-conquest like the label said. The Veth used biometric locking on all their sensitive archives, a rolling code tied to an overseer's glandular signature, but this one was sealed with a different mechanism. Older. She'd seen something like it once before, years ago in a lower archive. The lock interface had small, worn engravings on it, not Veth script, something else. She looked at the door, she looked at the window, she looked at the cylinder. She opened it. Not with a Veth key. She pressed her own thumb to the mechanism, half expecting an alarm, and felt a faint warmth pulse through the metal, and then the cylinder unsealed. That was the first thing that should have been impossible. The documents inside were not Veth documents. They were human documents. Old ones, not paper, but the early Prestrezen data sheets that humans had used for about 40 years in the late 21st century, before the conquest had made the question of human data storage infrastructure irrelevant. The script was standard English, which Cale could read because the archive work required trilingual processing, and because she had also, at age 14, secretly memorized every recovered page of pre-conquest human text that passed through her hands. She read the first page. She read it again. She set the cylinder down carefully on the shelf and stood there for a long moment with one hand pressed flat against the cool metal of the rack, and her breathing doing something she had not given it permission to do. The document was a genetic registry. Not a Veth genetic registry. Those were clinical, numerical, annotated in the cold shorthand of resource classification. This was a human registry, pre-conquest. A project, it seemed, begun in the 2080s by a coalition of what the document called continuity architects, a group of human scientists, historians, geneticists, and what appeared to be a small number of former political leaders who had seen the Veth advance through the outer system and understood what was coming. They had hidden things. Not weapons, not armies. The Veth would have found those. They had hidden something harder to find and infinitely more dangerous, a record of who certain people were, of what certain bloodlines carried. Not royal bloodlines in any human monarchical sense, but something the document described with a phrase Cale had to read 4 times before she accepted that she was reading it correctly. Bioarchival resistance coding. She was still processing the phrase when she heard Orcs' footsteps in the corridor. Cale filed the cylinder, not improperly this time. She filed it in the correct location, redundant biological survey, pre-conquest, Sector 7, subsection 14, and she picked up her carrying tray and she walked to the next shelf. And by the time the senior overseer pushed open the archive door, she was cross-referencing atmospheric maintenance contracts with the expression that had once been described as pleasantly bovine. Case 7 Orcs, Orcs said. He always used the designation. He was a tall Veth, charcoal gray plating over the upper thorax, the lower face a suggestion of something that might have been a mouth if you were feeling generous. His eyes were secondary. The Veth primary sensory organs were olfactory and electromagnetic, but he used the eyes when addressing domestics because the domestics found it easier. He had learned this the way a zookeeper learns which enclosure door swings the right way. Practical, not kind. The morning cycle ends in 40 minutes. You have a relay run to Subarchive 3 after the break. Understood, Cale said. He looked at her for a moment with those secondary eyes, and she felt the collar register her heartbeat, and she had spent 11 years making sure her heartbeat never did anything interesting, and it didn't now. 78 beats per minute. Compliant. Bovine. He left. She waited 4 minutes and 40 seconds, which was the length of time it took Orcs to complete his morning circuit of the upper archive floors. Then she went back to the cylinder. Bioarchival resistance coding was, as far as she could piece together from a 15-minute standing read that she conducted while appearing to catalog adjacent files, a genetic engineering project. The humans of the 2080s had understood something about the Veth that the Veth themselves had not publicized, and that most conquered species never learned until too late. The Veth's method of population control relied on a biological override mechanism. The collars, the census, the compliance ratings, all of that was the visible superstructure. Underneath it was something neurological. A Veth-designed modification, introduced through the atmospheric processors that every occupied world depended on for breathable air, that over 3 to 4 generations gradually suppressed specific neurological pathways, the ones associated with coordinated resistance, long-range planning, the cognitive architecture of organized defiance. Not intelligence. The Veth needed their domestics functional, just the specific kind of intelligence that could threaten them. The continuity architects had found this. They had designed a counter, not a cure. They hadn't had time for a cure. They had designed a carrier, a sequence of genetic markers that, if introduced into a bloodline and allowed to propagate naturally across generations, would block the Veth modification, would preserve, in the descendants of those who carried it, the full neurological architecture that the occupation's atmospheric slow burn was designed to erase. They had called the people who carried it custodians. They had hidden the registry of those bloodlines in a pre-conquest archive cylinder, locked with a biometric key that responded to human DNA. Any human could open it, but only someone who was looking for it in the right archive, on the right shelf, with the right inclination to read things she was not supposed to read, would ever find it. Kale read the names. There were 47 of them. Families, not individuals. The project tracked bloodlines forward, projecting where the markers would propagate if the carriers had children, and where those children had children, across 3 generations of conquest. The document included probability maps, estimated survival rates, notes on which family lines had likely been separated in the initial classification sweeps, and how the markers might have dispersed through the domestic labor pool. The 47th name on the list was her mother's. She was certain of this the way she was certain of very few things, not through any mystical recognition, but through the same methodical cross-referencing that had made her the best archivist on the upper floors, despite being a grade II domestic, who was not supposed to be doing anything more cognitively complex than sorting intake logs. She had found fragments of her own intake record 3 years earlier, filed incorrectly in a water reclamation subindex. She knew her origin point, a settlement called Myra Station, pre-conquest designation, Southwestern Administrative Zone, Old North America. She knew her intake age had been listed as approximately 7 years. She knew her biological classification at intake had noted an anomalous neural signature that the processing officer had flagged and then dismissed as instrument error. It wasn't instrument error. It was the resistance coding, intact, fully expressed, sitting in the neural architecture of a 7-year-old girl who had been separated from her family in a census sweep and assigned a number and given to an archive floor to spend her life filing documents she was not supposed to read. She stood there a long time. Outside the archive windows, Station Pale turned slowly in its orbit, and the light shifted from the pale gold of the primary star's morning angle to the cooler silver of mid-cycle, and somewhere several floors below, the kitchen domestics were beginning the prep work for the Veth administration's midday meal, and the atmospheric processors hummed their steady, patient hum. Then Kale put the cylinder back, picked up her carrying tray, and walked to Subarchive 3 to do her relay run. She needed to think. The thinking took 11 days. 11 days of compliant, bovine, 97.4 rated work on the upper archive floors. 11 days of relay runs and cross-referencing and filing, and standing at the window during the permitted rest intervals looking out at the station's docking rings, with the expression of an animal who has no particular interest in the docking rings. 11 days of eating her ration portions in the domestic mess with 30 other grade I and II workers, listening to their conversations about overseer moods and ration quality, and the rumors that always circulated about possible reassignments, and contributing to those conversations exactly as much as she always had, which was enough to register as socially functional and no more. She was thinking about the atmospheric processors. She was thinking about 47 bloodlines and 3 generations of dispersal, and the probability maps in the pre-conquest document, and the fact that the resistance coding, if it worked as described, meant that the people who carried it were, or would be, if enough of the suppression had already been reversed in those who were fully expressed like herself, cognitively intact in the precise ways the Veth had spent 43 years trying to prevent. She was thinking about what that meant for the other domestics, for the ones whose family lines were on the list, For the children in the lower rings, who were now the third generation under the atmospheric modification, and who might or might not have received the coding from a parent or grandparent who'd never known they carried it. She was thinking about the fact that she had just found, in an improperly filed pre-conquest cylinder, what might be the only surviving record of who those people were. On the 12th day, she made a mistake. Not a real mistake, a calculated one. She misfiled a routine atmospheric maintenance contract 3 subsections away from its correct location, in a subindex she knew was reviewed only once per quarter by a low-ranked Veth administrative assistant named Prethar, who was thorough but slow, and who would not reach the error for at least 60 days. In the time between, anyone who checked that subindex looking for routine documents would find, alongside the misfiled maintenance contract, a cross-reference note in the standard archival notation, added by Kale, in the compliant, legible hand of a well-trained domestic, that pointed to a cylinder in redundant biological survey, pre-conquest, Sector 7, subsection 14. She filed the cross-reference note under the name of an overseer who had been transferred off-station 8 months earlier, and whose filing access codes had not yet been revoked from the system. It wasn't a breadcrumb. It was a signal fire built to look like administrative clutter. She waited to see who noticed. His name was Den. She did not know this for 6 more days. What she knew, on the 16th day after finding the cylinder, was that someone had accessed the cross-reference note. She knew this because she had developed, over 11 years of archival work, a precise spatial memory for the arrangement of documents in any given subindex, and she noticed when things had been touched. Not moved, touching was enough. The particular way a document settles back into place is microscopically different when it's been lifted and replaced rather than simply left. You develop an eye for it when your survival has depended for over a decade on noticing exactly that kind of thing. Someone had read the note. She waited. She filed. She completed her relay runs with a 97.4 compliance rating. On the 18th day, she found a folded resin sheet in the sleeve of her work shift when she dressed in the morning. It was not there when she had undressed the night before. It had been placed there during the domestic rest period, which meant whoever placed it had access to the residential corridors. Unlikely for a Veth overseer, very possible for another domestic. The note said in English, which was not commonly written among the third-generation domestics who had grown up with Veth as their primary language. I read it. There are more of us than you think. Don't look for me. I'll find you. She burned the note in the atmospheric exhaust vent behind the water dispensary, which was the one place on the floor without sensor coverage, because the heat differential scrambled the detection array. She had known about that gap for 7 years. She had never used it until now. She went to work. Den found her in the Subarchive 3 corridor 11 days later, and she almost hit him with a data cylinder because she had not, despite everything, expected someone to simply walk up to her in the middle of a relay run and say, quietly, in the tone of someone asking about the weather, "You're the one who filed the cross-reference." He was a grade III maintenance domestic, lower classification than her, assigned to the atmospheric processor sublevels 3 floors below. He was perhaps 25, dark-complexioned, with the particular kind of lean that comes from a life of physical work and ration portions calibrated for function rather than comfort. He had a scar along his left jaw that had been improperly treated and had healed badly. His compliance rating, he told her later, was 94.1, which he maintained through a carefully cultivated reputation for being slightly stupid. "People expect less from you if they think you're slow," he said. "It's the most useful thing I've learned." They talked in the atmospheric exhaust vent corridor for 6 minutes, which was the maximum safe interval before the maintenance cycle log would register an unexplained absence. They talked again 3 days later, and then 4 days after that, and then the intervals compressed, and the network grew. Because Den was not alone. He had been building something for 3 years before Kale found the cylinder. Carefully, slowly, the way you build anything that must not be seen, one connection at a time, in stolen intervals, through the particular genius of people who have been underestimated so thoroughly, and for so long that the underestimation has become a kind of camouflage. A kitchen domestic named Sira, who had maintained a 96.8 compliance rating for 9 years, by being exceptionally good at her assigned work, and entirely invisible in every other respect. A cargo handler named Bryce, who moved supply manifests between sublevels, and had spent 2 years mapping every sensor gap in the station's lower ring. An atmospheric technician named Paul, who had, over the course of many maintenance shifts, developed what she described with quiet precision as a very specific understanding of the processor filtration arrays. They were not a resistance movement. They did not have weapons or a plan or a manifesto. What they had was the same thing Kale had, the ability to see clearly in a place where no one expected them to see anything at all. The cylinder changed that. Not immediately, not dramatically. What it did, when Kale finally brought the group to the archive on a maintenance window night and let each of them read what she had read, was give form to something that had been formless. It told them not just that the resistance coding existed, but who might carry it. It gave them names, not individual names, because the third-generation dispersal had scattered the bloodlines far beyond any specific list, but family line markers that Kale could cross-reference against the intake records she had spent 11 years filing and memorizing. Bloodline traces that, if you knew how to read the anomalous neural classification notes that intake officers had been writing off as instrument error for 40 years, told you something. There were more of them than anyone had known. Not just on Station Pale. The cylinder's probability maps extended across the occupation's administrative zones. The resistance coding had propagated the way its designers had intended, quietly, biologically, one generation passing it to the next without knowing what they carried, while the atmospheric processors worked their slow erosion, and the Veth census kept careful count of everything except the one variable that mattered. They built it to find us, Kale said. She was looking at the probability map, at the branching lines of bloodline dispersal, and something in her chest was doing what it had been doing on and off for the past weeks. A tightening, a pressure, as if some organ had been held compressed for 20 years and was only now being allowed to expand. The continuity architects. They built the lock to respond to human DNA, not to a specific person, not to a code, just anyone, any human who found it and put their hand on it. 40 years, Den said. They expected it would take time. They expected someone would be looking. Kale thought about this, about the 47 bloodlines and the probability maps and the patient, long-range intelligence of people who had seen the conquest coming and had done not the heroic thing, not the dramatic stand, not the weapon or the army or the grand gesture, but the small, precise, enduring thing, the thing designed to outlast them, the thing that required at the other end of it only someone willing to read what they were not supposed to read. The atmospheric processors, Paul said. She had been quiet while the others read, sitting with her forearms on her knees and her eyes on the middle distance in the way she had when she was working through something technical. The modification is introduced through the filtration arrays, aerosolized. Third-generation exposure produces the full suppression effect, but it requires continuous delivery. If the arrays were modified. To deliver what? Bryce asked. The coding is genetic, Kale said. You can't aerosolize a bloodline. No, Paul said, but the suppression is neurological, not genetic. The modification works by binding to specific receptor sites. If you could introduce a competitive inhibitor, something that occupied those sites without triggering the suppression cascade, she paused. I've been looking at the filtration chemistry for 2 years. There's a compound class that could work. I've run it in simulation. It doesn't require anything the processors don't already handle. Everyone looked at her. "I didn't know what I was looking for until now," Paul said. "Now I know." It took 4 months. 4 months of 97.4 and 94.1 and 96.8, and compliant, bovine, pleasantly unremarkable work on every floor of Station Pale. 4 months of Cale filing and reading, and leaving nothing in the archive that wasn't exactly where it was supposed to be. 4 months of Den and Bryce mapping service corridors and SIRA sourcing, compounds through the kitchen's chemical requisition system, with the unhurried competence of someone who had been doing kitchen domestic work for 9 years, and was very, very good at acquiring supplies through the administrative cracks that opened wherever there was routine, unchecked procurement. 4 months of Paul in the atmospheric processor sublevels, making small adjustments to filtration chemistry parameters that fell within the maintenance variance window, and that would not trip any monitoring flag, because she had spent 3 years learning exactly where the monitoring flags were. Cale thought about her mother sometimes. Not with grief exactly. Grief required a loss that had a shape, and the loss of a mother at age 7 in the chaos of a census sweep was not shaped. It was ambient. It was part of the texture of everything. What she thought about was the moment her mother had put her thumb to the cylinder lock. Cale didn't know that her mother had done that, didn't know the specifics of anything, but she had constructed the narrative from the available evidence the way you construct anything from available evidence, carefully and without overclaiming, and the narrative required that someone in her family line had known, had found a cylinder somewhere, had understood enough to understand that what they carried mattered, and that it needed to be hidden, and that the hiding needed to be organic, not in a vault, not in an encrypted file, but in the body, in the blood, in the particular architecture of a nervous system that passed from mother to child to grandchild through 40 years of occupation. She thought about what it cost to carry something that carefully, for that long, without knowing if anyone would ever find the key. She thought, "I found it." She thought, "I'm not going to waste it." The processors came online on the 44th anniversary of the occupation, which was not deliberate symbolism. Paul had chosen the date because it aligned with a routine deep maintenance cycle that would require the filtration arrays to be taken offline briefly for inspection, and the offline period was when the adjustment could be made most cleanly. But Cale thought about it afterward, 44 years. The continuity architects had expected something, had built for something. Not a date, they couldn't have known a date, but a moment when someone, somewhere in the propagated bloodlines, would find the cylinder and read it and understand. This was the moment. There was no speech, no gathering, no dramatic declaration, because everything that made a gathering dramatic also made it visible, and visible was the one thing they could not afford to be. Cale was in the upper archive filing routine contracts when Paul made the adjustment. Den was in a maintenance corridor 3 floors below, running a service check that he had scheduled 6 weeks in advance. Bryce was moving supply manifests. Sierra was preparing the Veth administration's midday meal, with the focused competence that had kept her unremarkable for 9 years. Cale knew the moment it happened because she felt it. Not physically, not immediately. It was subtler than that, a quality of attention, a clarifying, as if something in the air had shifted from a frequency she'd been filtering out her whole life to one she could actually hear. She had thought she was already thinking clearly. She had thought she was already operating at the full capacity available to her. She understood now that she had been thinking clearly inside a room with the ceiling lowered, and the ceiling had just been raised, and the room was much larger than she'd known. She kept filing, but her eyes moved differently across the documents in front of her. She saw connections she had not seen before. Not between the documents, she already knew those, but between the documents and the larger systems. The supply chain architectures and the administrative reporting hierarchies, and the specific, granular vulnerabilities in the Veth occupation's infrastructure that only someone who had been filing administrative paperwork for 11 years, and now, had the full cognitive architecture to understand what she was reading could have seen. She thought that's what they were trying to prevent. The Veth had not built the atmospheric modification to keep humans passive, because passive humans were easier to manage. Not exactly. They had built it because humans who were fully cognitively intact, and who had 40+ years of intimate knowledge of the occupation's administrative infrastructure, were precisely, structurally dangerous in a way that no weapon could replicate. A weapon could be found. A weapon could be confiscated. You could not confiscate 11 years of archival memory and the suddenly unleashed capacity to understand every implication of what it contained. She thought about the other domestics, about Den's 94.1 compliance score and the particular intelligence of someone who had been maintaining the pretense of slight stupidity for years, about Sierra's 9 years of kitchen invisibility, about Bryce mapping sensor gaps with the patient thoroughness of someone who didn't know yet what the map was for, but made it anyway, because the instinct to map things carefully was exactly the kind of instinct the modification was designed to suppress and had failed to suppress in him. She thought about the 47 bloodlines, and the probability maps, and the third-generation dispersal, and the number of domestics across this station and the other stations, and the other occupied worlds who might be sitting in their various assigned places right now, filing and maintaining and carrying and cleaning, with the resistance coding active in their neural architecture and the atmospheric modification no longer able to reach the receptor sites it needed, and the ceiling going up, and the room getting larger, and the documents in front of them suddenly saying something they hadn't said before. She stayed at her shelf for the rest of the shift. She completed her relay run. She maintained her 97.4 compliance rating. And she began, in the careful, methodical, unhurried way of someone who has learned that the most enduring things are built slowly, to plan. Orlsec noticed something on the 31st day. Not Kale specifically. She had been too careful for that. What he noticed was a pattern, a very slight increase in what the Veth monitoring systems classified as anomalous cognitive engagement markers among the domestic population of Station Pale's upper and middle rings. The marker was subtle, the kind of thing that would have registered as statistical noise in a normal cycle. But Orlsec was, for all his limitations, a thorough administrator, and he had been overseeing domestic populations for 20 years, and he knew what a baseline looked like. He called a census review. Kale found out about it when the census review notice was filed in the administrative intake log, which she processed as part of her morning intake routine, which she processed with a compliance rating of 97.4 and an expression that could only be described as pleasantly bovine. She had 11 days before the review team arrived. She spent them well. The census review was designed to do two things: re-verify the biological classification of the domestic population and update the compliance monitoring data. The biological reclassification was the dangerous part. A Veth classification technician with current equipment, running a proper neural architecture scan on Kale or Den or Paul, would identify the resistance coding within minutes. They would identify the atmospheric modification's failure to suppress it. They would flag the individuals, and then the Veth would know they had a problem. Kale needed the census review to not find anything. She needed this without doing anything that would itself register as anomalous. She spent 2 days reviewing every census procedure document she had ever filed, and she had filed all of them, because census documentation went through the upper archive as a matter of administrative record, and she had been filing and memorizing documents for 11 years. She knew the review team's methodology. She knew the sequence of scans. She knew the specific equipment variants the Veth used for neural architecture assessment, their error rates, their calibration protocols, and because she had filed the maintenance records for the station's biological assessment lab, and she had a very good memory, the exact current calibration state of the lab's primary scanner array. The array had been calibrated 14 months ago. It was due for recalibration. It had not been scheduled for recalibration because the administrative assistant responsible for scheduling had been transferred 8 months ago, and the transfer had created a gap in the maintenance log that no one had caught, because the gap was in a subindex that was reviewed only quarterly, and the quarterly review was not due for another 3 weeks. Kale was the person who maintained that subindex. She scheduled the recalibration for 7 days before the census review. The recalibration was routine, proper procedure, the kind of administrative housekeeping that a well-trained archive domestic would naturally attend to when reviewing upcoming census procedures. OralSec, had he noticed the scheduling note, would have seen nothing more than a grade II domestic being appropriately thorough. The recalibration of a neural architecture scanner, if done by a technician following standard protocol, takes about 4 hours and results in a scanner that reads within VETH standard parameters. If done by a technician who has access to the calibration specifications and who introduces a very small systematic offset, well within the instrument's stated variance window, the kind of offset that could plausibly occur as natural drift, the scanner will produce results that read as normal for what it expects to find, which is the suppressed neural architecture it has been calibrated to identify, rather than the fully intact architecture that now characterizes a growing number of Station Pale's domestic population. The maintenance technician who performed the recalibration was not Paul. Paul worked in the atmospheric sublevels and had no business being in the biological assessment lab. The technician was a grade I equipment specialist named Hara, who Kale had not spoken to directly, but who Den had, carefully, over the course of several maintenance corridor conversations across the previous 2 months. Hara's compliance rating was 91.3. Kale had thought that was a liability. Den had thought it was an asset. Den was right. A 91.3 domestic was expected to make small procedural errors. A 91.3 domestic recalibrating an instrument with a marginal systematic offset was not a conspiracy. It was a maintenance log entry. The census review ran for 3 days. The scanner found nothing anomalous. OralSec reviewed the results. He reviewed them again. He filed a notation that the cognitive engagement markers had likely been a monitoring artifact, scheduled a system recalibration of the monitoring array, and closed the census review. Kale filed the closure documentation. She was very careful not to let her hands shake. The network grew slowly, and then quickly, the way fire grows when it finds the right material, not explosively, but with the particular momentum of a thing that has found its proper conditions. 60 days after the processor adjustment, they had contact with 7 other stations, not through any channel the VETH monitored, not through any channel at all, in the conventional sense. Through the supply manifests that Bryce moved between sublevels, which went to cargo handlers on other stations, some of whom had been carrying fragments of their own pieces of this for years without knowing the other pieces existed. Through the kitchen procurement networks that Sierra understood better than anyone, which connected domestic supply staff across dozens of stations, in ways the VETH administration had never thought to examine because domestics talking about ration supplies was not a security concern. Through the atmospheric maintenance protocols that Paul cross-referenced with the technical staff on the other stations, in the language of maintenance specifications and filtration chemistry, parameters that no VETH overseer would have cause to read carefully. What they passed through these channels was not plans. Plans could be found. What they passed were seeds. The cross-reference note, the probability map, the calibration methodology, the specific, technically precise knowledge of how to make the processor adjustment without tripping monitoring flags, encoded in maintenance specification language that read as routine procedure to anyone who wasn't looking for it. They were not building a resistance movement. Kale resisted that framing every time Den used it, which he did occasionally in their maintenance corridor meetings, with the particular idealism of someone who had been waiting a long time for something to be happening. She understood the impulse. She had felt something like it herself, in the weeks after reading The Cylinder, before the thinking had clarified. A resistance movement is a thing they can find, she said. It has edges. It has leaders. It has a moment when it acts, which means there's a moment before it acts when it can be detected and stopped. What we're building doesn't have any of those things. What does it have? Time, she said. And the specific kind of knowledge that looks like nothing until it doesn't. There was a morning in the 8th month, after the processor adjustment, when Kale stood at the archive window during her permitted rest interval and watched a Veth supply shuttle dock at Station Pale's upper ring, and felt, for the first time in her life, something that she had no word for in Veth and could only find in the recovered fragments of pre-conquest English text she had been reading for years. Not hope. Hope was forward-looking, expectant, dependent on outcomes. This was different. It was a kind of settled confidence in the weight of what was already done. In the 47 bloodlines and the probability maps and the slow propagation of a countermeasure that no one had known was being deployed, because it was being deployed in the body, in the blood, in the neural architecture of children who grew up to be domestics who filed documents they were not supposed to read. In the cross-reference notes distributed through supply chains and kitchen procurement networks and maintenance specification language, spreading outward from Station Pale to 7 other stations, and then outward from those to others, not like fire but like roots, unseen, patient, reaching. In the continuity architects, whoever they had been, who had understood that the most durable human acts are not the heroic ones, who had understood that the specific genius of humanity, the thing that made it difficult to permanently suppress, the thing that the Veth modification had identified as the threat worth 40 years of atmospheric slow burn, was not courage or strength or even intelligence, exactly. It was the capacity to do the small, precise, undramatic thing that would matter in 40 years, and to trust, without evidence, without certainty, without any guarantee at all, that someone downstream would be in the right place to find it. They had trusted her. She had been a 7-year-old girl with an anomalous neural signature in a census sweep, and they had built something that would wait for her, that would open for her, that had her bloodline in its probability maps. They had trusted her without knowing her name, and she had spent 43 years as K7 being quietly, bovinely, systematically more than anyone had bothered to measure. She thought about the word custodian. She thought she understood it now. Not guardian of a thing, not keeper of a weapon or a plan or a secret. Custodian of a capacity, of the specific, dangerous, unkillable human capability to see clearly, remember precisely, and act slowly in a direction that no one is looking. She went back to her shelf. She filed the morning intake contracts with a compliance rating that, when the daily update went through to the station registry, read as 97.4. It was not the last day. There were many more days of work ahead, patient, undramatic, methodical work, the kind that left no signature and built no monument and announced itself to no one. The Veth would not understand what was happening to them until the understanding arrived all at once, complete, with the particular quality of a thing that had been prepared for a long time and that bore the mark of human patience. Not fast, not dramatic, not the thing anyone had been watching for. But that morning, standing at the archive window with the light coming through actual glass and the shuttle moving against the stars, Kale let herself feel, just for a moment, the shape of what her mother's mother's mother had begun. It was a good shape. It was the shape of a door open. She had been standing in this room for 11 years. She knew exactly where every document was. She knew exactly what they said. And now she knew, with the particular clarity of a nervous system finally allowed to work at its full capacity, what to do with all of it. She had not been a slave princess, discovering the truth about her bloodline. She had been the truth, waiting to discover itself. The difference mattered. The continuity architects had understood that. They had not built a savior into the bloodline, not a chosen one, not a destined hero, not someone whose specialness would announce itself dramatically in the appointed hour. They had built a capability, a tendency toward precision and patience, and the willingness to read things carefully. Distributed it across 47 families. Let it propagate. Let the occupation sort the carriers into positions where those qualities would be most dangerous, which was exactly what the Veth had done, efficiently and without understanding, when they had looked at a 7-year-old girl with an anomalous neural signature and said, "Archive work, upper floors, grade II domestic, good with documents." Kale smiled at the shuttle, a small smile, the kind that didn't register on behavioral monitoring. Then she went back to work. The room was very large. She had only just begun to map it.